If you've spent any length of time scrolling through social media, you'll have learned that there's a lot of pseudoscience and misinformation out there, or maybe you haven't. It's often delivered by scientists, doctors, celebrities, and influencers we trust, so it's really hard to know what's fake and what's real. Fluoride is lowering your IQ. Heard that one? What about the raw milk trend? Is that the secret sauce that will transform your health? GMOs are scary. Organic is the holy grail of health. Mammograms give you cancer. We're made to fear our health, and the worst part is the advice these wellness gurus and experts are dishing out is far from harmless. I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and in this podcast, we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science and medicine. And today I'm joined by biomedical scientist Dr. Andrea Love, who's made it her mission to debunk the worst of internet pseudoscience and improve science literacy. So let's get to the bottom of all these wild health claims and separate fact from fiction. Enjoy. Dr. Andrea Love, thank you so much for joining me. And it's strange because we've been following each other online for a while, and I feel like I know you through your content, your science literacy, your communication, but this is the first time that we've spoken face to face, and we find ourselves in a strange place online where I personally feel that social media has provided so much good in terms of empowering people to take greater ownership of their own health, providing science communication, but we also know it's a double-edged sword with lots of misinformation online. How do you navigate that, and what do you feel are the main obstacles to people really getting to the right information online?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me, and the same goes for you. I've always loved the way that you make the science relatable, make these topics relatable, and I think, that really goes to the crux of the problem is that, when people are logging in to whatever social media platform or news platform, they're kind of up against this, factual content that really reflects the nuance of these really complex topics. And then you have kind of the clickbait fear mongering that, make these very emotionally laden arguments. They're often black or white. They're misrepresenting reality. And in the end, what they do is they elicit these feelings of fear and anxiety and concern, and that even the most logically minded person, if they hear something that's really scary, it's going to kind of shut off that logical component. And I think that's really what we're up against. And, we find that a lot of people that are really online trying to do good communication, good science education, they don't have as much infrastructure behind them. They don't have funding. They're not taking the sponsorships from these unregulated wellness companies because, there's a sense of moral obligation. And, we don't want to take resources, financial backing from companies that are trying to actively exploit these health fears of people. And so, the reach they have because of these financial resources is much more widespread, and the fact that fake news travels faster than credible information. It really is kind of this battle of fact versus fiction.
I feel also a significant problem online comes from those top-down organizations, maybe even governmental organizations, or even international organizations like the World Health Organization, who are historically seen as a bastion of health information. But actually, as we've seen over the last few years, some of their communication style has been less than optimal. And I guess one of the things which we focus on, one of the, subgroups of the WHO, the IARC, who essentially tell the general public that various chemicals and items that people come into contact with are potentially carcinogenic or possibly carcinogenic. I feel some of the language they use and how they demonstrate that to the public is nothing but fear-mongering, even if that's not their intent. That's how it comes across. And unfortunately, as we both know, even good information can be turned into bad information if it's not structured or communicated in the right way. Like, for example, I remember when this first hit the headlines, when people were talking about coffee, aloe vera, things like that being possible carcinogenic or possibly carcinogenic. So everyone's out there saying, oh, your aloe vera drink is now carcinogenic. Your coffee is going to give you cancer. But then you've got all this information saying that coffee is beneficial for health. So it really confuses the public. And I really feel that sort of messaging can erode public trust. What is your take on that whole carcinogen list by the IARC and the WHO?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. I would say the IARC is probably one of the biggest thorns in the sides of biomedical scientists like myself who work in cancer research and immunotherapy. And the distinction you make here, the fact that it is a working group within the WHO is really important because people conflate the IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, as the whole World Health Organization. But it's not. It's a singular working group. It's got a member entity. And what the IARC does is they perform hazard assessments. And a hazard assessment is very different from looking at whether you have a realistic risk of, say, in this context, cancer from the exposure of some sort of entity. And just for context, they've assessed about 215 different exposures, including things like night shift work. And pretty much all of those things they've assessed have fallen into some criteria on their list. And the reason for that is because hazard is very different from actual likelihood of cancer. And so the IARC basically just says, is there any world in which theoretically could this thing cause cancer under any circumstance? And in cancer biology, we know that cancer is multifactorial. It's hundreds of different diseases, and it requires multiple insults in order to your cells no longer behave the way they should. They start to reproduce uncontrollably. They're not listening to all of the regular cues to say, hey, you need to stop growing, and they form a tumor. And so technically, everything could theoretically cause cancer at a certain exposure. In Cancer Biology 101, you find that in mouse models, if you blast them with excessive doses of cinnamon, for example, you can cause tumor formation. And so this really is misleading because it's not the story of what's happening to people, right? And so the IARC looks at these hazards, but they don't actually look at the actual risk, the actual likelihood that this substance or this exposure is truly related to cancer in a causal relationship, meaning the exposure of that thing increases the risk of developing a certain cancer. And so that really confuses the public, especially because all of the other agencies that look at cancer risk or toxicity risks of chemicals, they do risk assessment. So there's a different group in the WHO called the JECFA, the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, and they actually study food ingredients and risk of exposure and adverse health effects. And theirs are based on realistic data, epidemiological evidence, animal studies, human data, and so on. And they're doing a risk assessment, but their decisions and their conclusions are very different than what the IARC says. And of course, media headlines always say, oh, it's the WHO saying this, which is not the case. So when you look at their actual classifications, they have one that's called possibly carcinogenic, and they have one that's called probably carcinogenic. And those don't mean what most people think them to mean in colloquial terms. Those terms, possibly, probably, they have really distinct meanings in science. It's like if you were a parent and your kid asked if you could have ice cream for dinner and you said maybe. We know maybe means no, right? And that's kind of the way you have to approach this. Is the possibly carcinogenic category means that there's actually no evidence that it is linked to cancer in humans. It could be a petri dish study that has some sort of plausible mechanism, or something with an animal model where they're usually giving an animal really excessive doses that nobody would actually encounter in real life. And so these things really mislead people because it causes all of this undue fear about things that really don't pose a risk to your health, and you don't need to be concerned or fearful of being exposed to those things.
I think on the topic of those fear-based messages, I feel that even a kernel of misinformation online can really grow into a full tree. And I've seen this when I recently made a video about, the benefits of mammograms, but also, the sometimes occasional risk that mammograms could miss certain things as a response to a video. And I saw littered within the comments section, there were multiple people saying that you shouldn't use mammograms because they cause radiation. And actually, instead, you should use thermography and thermal scans. And this is something, obviously, which, if you've done any research at all, you can find within 10 seconds that it's complete pseudoscience with no evidence that thermography or thermal imaging scans is effective at picking up cancer, because it's kind of a bit of a ridiculous idea, because any form of inflammation or infection can be hot and not be a cancer, so there can be a high risk of false positives and false negatives, which is the worst kind of test you can get. And that really worries me, because that then goes into the area of people not just being misinformed and thinking, oh, okay, I'm thinking about the wrong thing, but then taking action on that misinformation and then missing out on treatments, missing out on screening. And then we've got a potential public health crisis where we could see people having a greater morbidity or mortality and, risk of illness because they're listening to these things online and not going to their screening appointments. What's your opinion on things like thermography and things which directly impact people to then make a decision not to adhere to traditional medicine?
I think that is the biggest harm of all of this pseudoscience, right? Because these harmful claims or these false claims, they're not just impacting what people are believing, it's affecting how they approach their life and the decisions they make on a daily basis. And I recently wrote a breast cancer myth article for Pop Sugar for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And I used also that example because you have a lot of celebrities who are now being perceived as experts in these topics. And because they have a large platform, they feel empowered to speak on things that they don't actually know anything about. And it's this, rejection of expertise and this parasocial relationship phenomenon of social media. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think this is the worst part of misinformation, is when it causes harm. And so mammograms have demonstrably improved the quality of life for people. They save lives. Because of mammograms, we can detect breast cancers earlier, before they've invaded lymph nodes, before they've spread elsewhere in the body. And as a result, they're more treatable. The prognoses are better. We have 5-year survival of breast cancer when diagnosed early, well above 90%. It's incredible. And we're actually seeing, harm to this, right? And so mammograms were added in the US as part of preventive screening in the 1970s. And, the technology was developed in the 60s. And as soon as they were implemented, we saw these spikes in cancer rates, right? But it wasn't because more breast cancer was occurring. It was because we were diagnosing it now. We weren't able to diagnose it before. And so people kind of misrepresent those trends to say, oh, well, it's linked to cancer. No, it's not. I mean, it's linked in the way that we can detect it using this technology. But since the 1950s, we've essentially halved mortality rate due to breast cancer. And that's because of these early interventions and screenings. And, people don't realize kind of the history of where we've come from. And so you have this survivor bias where we have people of immense privilege and wealth, and they get in front of a camera and they're like, well, I did this and I did that and I was fine. And people uplift these anecdotes as evidence, but it's not true. And people who maybe idolize someone like Elle Macpherson, who lied to her audience about the fact that she had a lumpectomy, which was curative for her type of breast cancer. But she told people she went to do a holistic nutrition, and she went to a chiropractor, and she did this all natural thing. They're going to read that, and they're not going to go look behind the curtain and be like, oh, she actually had surgical removal of her breast cancer. And they're going to think, well, if Elle Macpherson did it, then I can do that too. And, I'm concerned about that, right? We know thermography, so it's looking for heat patterns. It can't accurately detect a breast cancer. It's not sensitive to detect breast cancer. It's not accurate, and that's why it's not recommended. But then you have these, chiropractors, people that are unqualified making, recommending this technology for screening breast cancer because they claim that the radiation that you'd be exposed to from a mammogram is harmful, when the amount of X-ray radiation you'd be exposed to during a mammogram is 10 times lower than what you experience simply by existing on this planet every
Background.
year. Yeah. And so, it's the same with the preventive. It's also the same thing we see when people are dissuaded from proven treatment interventions for things like cancer. We see that we have with breast cancer, people that avoid legitimate treatments, things like surgeries, things like chemotherapeutics, immunotherapy, radiation, and they go for these, alternatives, chiropractor, acupuncture, dietary supplements. They have 5.7 times higher risk of dying from cancer. And breast cancer is very treatable when diagnosed early. And that is the biggest problem I have with all of this, is that not only are they making a lot of money by lying to people and eroding trust in real science, but it's causing a lot of harm.
I think while I'm annoyed by a lot of the pseudoscience, when I see all of these comments of, people from, the general public thinking about other scans, I feel a bit of sympathy, because I feel that at some point along the way, they've been failed by traditional medicine. Whether that's accidentally failed because when they went for a breast scan, potentially their cancer was maybe missed or not picked up, because, all tests are limited in terms of their sensitivity and specificity. There's nothing which is 100% accurate all the time. And then they're led astray by pseudoscientists. But also sometimes, as we alluded to before, the messaging may not be ideal. For example, in the UK, when you go to the NHS and you are invited to go for a mammogram, you are never told about your breast density. You're told about your breast density score if you go privately. They give you a BI-RAD score, which scores your breast density from A to D. And we also know that the denser your breasts and the more breast tissue and the less fatty tissue there is, you may benefit from an ultrasound to pick up any additional lumps. And as you age, your breasts become less dense. So mammograms may be, better and more sensitive. But for younger women, or who are higher risk of certain, genetic types of breast cancer or other things, and are invited for early screening, they may benefit from other types of scans like ultrasounds or MRIs. So I understand this communication sometimes isn't given to women, and how to be aware of their breast risk, how to advocate for themselves. And, this leads me to one of the sort of, I guess, most famous examples of a celebrity, influencer, or notable person then going astray. And you mentioned Elle Macpherson, but something which is a bit closer to me, because it comes under my realm of general surgery, is Steve Jobs. And, Steve Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a neuroendocrine tumor, which is actually very treatable with surgery and very resectable. Pancreatic cancer is usually abysmal in terms of prognosis, as you'll know, but neuroendocrine, that subtype of pancreatic cancer, is, if you catch it early, you can actually treat it pretty effectively. And for whatever reason, he didn't go ahead with surgery, delayed, went on various fruitarian diets and juice diets and these holistic approaches, to the point where it progressed, it spread to his liver, and it got to a point where his cancer was no longer operable. It became inoperable. And once he chose treatment, it was no longer a viable option, and he passed away. You could argue because of delaying seeking that initial surgery, which is really sad. One of the greatest minds of the generation, I guess, falling at the hurdle of pseudoscience. And really, it makes me wonder what harm celebrities and even influencers online could have in the pursuit of likes and views and engagement, because behind that is actually a string of people who hold on to every word they say.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And we see this far too often, right? aside from Elle Macpherson, Steve Jobs, Ananda Lewis recently, came out and said she now has stage 4 breast cancer because she refused mammograms for years when she was younger because she believed they were harmful. And then when she was diagnosed, finally diagnosed, when she finally got a mammogram years after she should have started her screening, it was now stage 3. Now, stage 3 is much more treatable than stage 4. Stage 3 5-year survival is about 72%. Stage 4 breast cancer, which she now has, where it's pretty much invaded multiple tissues. It's spread to multiple lymph nodes. It's considered to be incurable. And at this point, any treatments are really to manage symptoms and slow down the continued spread. 5-year survival for stage 4 breast cancer is only about 25%. And so, when she was diagnosed as stage 3, even after refusing the mammogram, she continued to forego conventional treatment. And she did the same thing, these diets and these supplements and these cleanses, because clearly her community and her belief structure kind of fed into that. And she probably was also surrounded with other people that kind of promoted that. And that's really, the biggest impact is that people online, because we have this social media and these celebrities are like a fingertip away, they idolize these people that they've seen on TV for years or they've seen held up by media outlets. And they think that they know information simply because they're famous, and anybody can fall prey to this type of misinformation, particularly when, they're making these illogical decisions on their health, because cancer can be a scary diagnosis. There's a lot of cancers that are incredibly treatable, and people don't fully understand cancers, but that's part of it, right? But all they hear about is like the anecdote of the person who did chemotherapy and they kind of like really struggled with side effects, and there's a lack of understanding about, why those side effects exist. And, I think obviously this comes down to a lot of literacy and science education, but there's no guardrails for kind of putting this false information online. And once people start to search for a topic, the algorithms kind of feed you more and more of that. So it can be really hard to kind of crawl out of that rabbit hole of misinformation. And certainly, it does a lot of harm, because while these people are also promoting the unproven stuff, they're often demonizing the proven stuff, right? It comes paired with the messaging. Oh, I don't trust scientists. I don't trust medicine. And as you noted, some of that is because they felt neglected. And here in the US, the big thing is the fact that we have no national healthcare program. And so we don't have access to preventive care for a large faction of the country. And we know that preventive care, preventive screenings, preventive medicine reduce the risk of poor outcomes. But if people are underinsured or uninsured, they can't even access these things without paying out of pocket. And so a lot of them will just forego it because they're like, well, I feel okay. I'm not gonna, I can't afford to do this. And then by the time something is diagnosed, then they feel let down. They feel like there's nobody looking out for them. And then they're especially vulnerable to those really appealing claims of, the wellness misinformation.
I guess, when you're on the topic of preventative medicine and people taking a greater ownership of their health and maybe then seeking these wellness opportunities, you can get into the topic of supplements and other holistic treatments. And I have somewhat softened my stance in some areas when it comes to supplements. I used to have a much harder stance. And I think on the one hand, I understand why people reach for supplements. We spoke about the sort of degradation of trust with traditional medicine and feeling that they can do something themselves that's proactive for their health. But also I understand that because socioeconomic factors play such a big role in determining health outcomes, we all talk about how, you can get all the nutrients you need from a varied diet. There may be populations and cohorts of people who, for whatever reason, may not always afford that nutritious varied diet. So I guess supplements or multivitamins in some cases could be a crutch for some people. Not saying that's a good thing, but at least short term, it may be a crutch. But also there are specific supplements I feel the more I sort of ideate on them, I feel, okay, I think that's maybe possible. Things like creatine, fiber supplements, which have good research behind them. And I certainly now I'm far more understanding that certain supplements in certain scenarios have a good role to play, not just in disease, so replacing magnesium in someone magnesium deficient, but also in improving health. For example, from when I was a kid, Indian household, we always had psyllium husk powders in the house. That's just like a staple in an Indian household. You probably in any South Asian household, you'll find some sort of fiber supplement. And it's actually just taken even, I consume a good amount of fiber in any given day just from meals alone, maybe 40, 50 grams. But I sometimes just like to add in some extra psyllium husk in my porridge, in my oats, just because, I feel that I can't get enough fiber. So I keep upping it up. So I feel that's where I've softened my stance. What is your take on supplements in general and any specific ones you take, or if you've changed your opinion on anything?
I love that you bring this up because a lot of times when I talk with other people about supplements, they're often looking at things like efficacy and I think that's really important, right? We don't want people wasting their money on things that are doing nothing. But I, as a scientist, I look at the safety, the risk profile. And so in the context of dietary supplements, especially in the US, there was political legislation that took away the safety oversight that used to be administered by the FDA. And so now all dietary supplements are unregulated. And so that is something that most people don't know. And so whenever I'm going to have a conversation with anybody about dietary supplements, whether you're talking about fiber supplements, which count, or a single ingredient vitamin or mineral, which also count, or you're talking about your herbal greens powders, proprietary blends, mixed bag, leaky gut supplements, hormone health support. These are all dietary supplements. And so there's a really broad spectrum in the quality and potential data behind them. But I think more people need to realize that it's a unregulated industry. There are companies that have been notoriously cited for having quality issues, meaning contamination with really harmful ingredients, for not disclosing ingredients that are in them that can have harmful medication or health issue interactions, or they say that something's in it and it's not in it, which, is obviously less harmful than not disclosing. Or they're sourcing from places in the world with their raw materials where you have higher levels of things like arsenic and lead in the soil. Yeah. And so I think more of that needs to be spoken about. But to your point, there are certain medical indications where certain very specific supplements, have a reasonably robust body of data. And, that would be things like prenatal vitamins and folic acid during pregnancy, people that have iron deficiency anemia, certain formulations of iron supplements can be beneficial, especially if you have, kind of borderline low. Personally, the only supplement I take is psyllium. I had a chronic anal fissure several years ago, and I just tripled my daily intake of fiber. I was eating all of the high fiber foods. But even after I had surgery to fix that, and thankfully I've been symptom free for quite a while, but I had a little PTSD. And so, I still kind of continue with my daily glass of Metamucil, and I similarly eat a lot of fiber in my diet. But that one has a very good safety profile, right? And so, that's kind of the approach I take. And for me, I understand that conventionally grown produce is nutritious and safe and not laden with pesticides. So I buy the more affordable produce so I can eat fruits and vegetables in most of my diet. But people often are either financially restricted or they've been scared from that because of misinformation. And so that's often why people go to that. So, if you're talking about supplements, I think you have to talk about the safety considerations, and the fact that there has been an increasing rate of acute organ toxicity, liver and kidney toxicity, as a result of dietary supplement overdoses, particularly herbal and proprietary blend, where you find a lot of these newer boutique companies, your AG1s and your Thorne and your this. But even with ones that are essential micronutrients, right? You can still overdose on vitamin C. You can still overdose on vitamin D.
Yeah.
And I think people, just like we talked about with water, there is such thing as too much of a good thing or even an essential thing. And that's kind of where you fall into that challenge. So when I talk about supplements, I really lead with that, because I think the safety is really important. And I would love for the U.S. to revoke the 1994 Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, because then there would be oversight and you would see a lot of these really harmful supplement companies get pulled, because right now it's really the Wild West.
I think while I have softened my stance on certain supplements, I think, your points there are very valid, that if someone is taking something, they should probably do their due diligence and check the safety profile of that specific company or brand supplements to see if they've undergone the necessary contamination testing, certifications, all that sort of, important things to check if it's safe to take. But also, again, the other bit of the due diligence is how much of XYZ does it contain? And do you need that more than your recommended daily intake? But I guess even beyond that, the problem with supplements, as you mentioned, it's a very broad umbrella term. There's a spectrum of things, something like whey protein or creatine or fiber supplements, which are well studied and can be efficacious in many people's lives, are far different than greens powders, something like berberine or ketone, which are, really understudied and really, more hype than health. So I think there's so many aspects to the supplement which we need to take into account. And just picking up on your point before about people meeting their requirements through foods, organic foods, etc. There seems to be that other trend, and it's been a trend which has been going on for decades, where people see the label organic on something and immediately assume that it's superior, either nutritionally, taste-wise, everything, because of a label organic. And then there's this, I guess, perception that organic equals no pesticide, which is untrue, because you can have organic pesticides sprayed onto those fruits or vegetables or plants. I mean, getting to the bottom of it, what is organic in the sense of what does it mean to the consumer versus something which is not organic?
Yeah. And it cracks me up because, we know organic in chemistry is a very different meaning. But yeah, organic in the context of consumer products is really related to how that plant was farmed. And so in the US in particular, and this is true for many European countries as well, it's a certification that is given to a given farm based on the type of farming method and the type of pesticides used on the farmland. And so there are a list of prohibited substances, so pesticides that you can't use, types of fertilizers or soil remediation that you can't use, and then there's a list of things that you can use, and that's really all it means. It doesn't, mean that it's pesticide free. In fact, many pesticides used in organic farming are not as safe. They're not as effective. They need to be used in higher quantities to control pests. And pests are anything that are going to strangle your crops. So they could be weeds, they could be insects, they could be fungi, fungal pathogens, they could be viruses, and so on. And so, farmers, especially when we're talking about feeding 8.1 billion people, you have to control pests on your cropland, because otherwise you won't be able to produce food. And so we have to use pesticides. But there's this perception, and this is really an intentional thing that has been done by many activist groups over decades to convince people that organic is pesticide free, it's more nutritious, it's safer, it's healthier, it's better for the farmers, it's better for the environment. And there's actually really no evidence to support any of those claims. And organic farming in the US also prohibits the use of genetic genetic tools for agriculture. And so in many instances, it's actually worse ecologically because you're using more land to produce the same yield of food. There are many GE crops that actually allow us to reduce the amount of pesticides used. So you're actually, contributing to having to continue to use pesticides to grow certain crops. And it really kind of goes into the whole organic label is really kind of feeding into this move towards anti-science, right? We're actually hindering the implementation of science innovation to improve the safety, the nutrition, the stability of crops that we're growing for food and for consumer products. And certainly, it's really a marketing label more than anything. And it's double the price on average, and it only costs about 5% more to produce organic foods or organic crops. And so it's really pure profit margin for the large scale organic farming organizations.
I think an adjacent topic, which you just alluded to there, was the topic of GMOs and genetically modified organisms or genetically engineered organisms. And really, this speaks to that move towards everything being natural, good for us fallacy or mentality that we have. And I guess for those people who think that GMO items are inherently dangerous, just need to look at the type of genetic manipulation we've been doing as humans, in various species, like everyone loves pugs and they're genetically modified in some way, maybe not in a lab, but we've been somehow genetically modifying and engineering dogs. Or, I think China sometimes sends certain species of the tomato plant to space so they can get genetically modified in space to be bigger or, receive some superpowers from radiation. And so there's so many types of manipulation we do. I mean, even those people who consume store-bought probiotic supplements. Some of those probiotic bacteria have been modified in a lab to be antibiotic resistant and all sorts. So actually, we've been doing that in countless ways in our environment. But why is it that people are so afraid against genetically modified crops, but also a lot of the genetic modification that we do is for our benefit nutritionally and health-wise?
You're absolutely right. Every food we eat is technically a GMO, a genetically modified organism. They vary in how we got to that place. Humans have been messing with nature since we existed, right? Domestication of all of our livestock, that was GMO, right? And that's kind of why scientists, we hate the term GMO. We'd rather use a more scientifically appropriate, like genetic engineering or gene edited, but because everything is a GMO, right? You wouldn't have actual tomatoes today because there are no genetically engineered tomatoes on the commercial market in the US without messing with them. You wouldn't have corn as we know it today without messing with teosinte. You wouldn't have strawberries today without messing with them. And so these are all like before genetic engineering, where we basically utilize the fact that there's a bacteria that normally infects plants, and we gave it a gene, a specific trait that we wanted it to transfer to the plant. It's really clever. But before that, what farmers or scientists would do was expose seeds to like high doses of mutagenic chemicals or radiation to mutate the seeds, and then saw what grew. And we're like, well, hey, we got this. And they didn't actually know what they were doing. It was completely random. And now we're doing this process of evolution in a faster but more controlled manner, where we're only changing one specific thing that we know does something advantageous. So for example, we have these herbicide tolerant crops. And the reason for that is not so we can spray them willy-nilly with herbicides. It's so we can control weeds that would strangle crops without having to use 5 different herbicides at higher concentrations and multiple times during the growing cycle. We can use this one herbicide that the crop won't get killed by, but it'll kill the weeds. And then you can grow that with only a single application. And we did that by swapping out one enzyme in the plant with a version of that enzyme that exists in bacteria. It's very elegant. It's very clever. And as a result, while glyphosate use has increased, we've seen a really dramatic decline of much more harmful herbicides because farmers want to use the safer products. They're the ones that are being exposed to this, right? But when you look at countries or places that are more resistant to these types of modern agriculture science, you see increased use of pesticides because GE crops, many of them actually give natural resistance to many pests. And so you don't have to spray them with chemicals. And that means that you're reducing the amount of pesticides you have to apply. And so GMO crops have allowed us to reduce pesticide application by over 8% in the last 20 years. We've reduced the ecological impact by over 17% of pesticides. We've also increased crop yields because now we can control pests that would destroy crops in a safer way. But you can also do other things, right? You can add nutrients to subsistence crops that normally don't have them. So golden rice is a great example. Rice is a staple crop for many developing nations, but it doesn't have a lot of nutrients aside from having calories and starch. And so in the 90s, scientists were able to impart beta carotene into rice, and that's a precursor of vitamin A. And we know vitamin A deficiency is very prevalent in developing nations, and it can lead to pediatric blindness. It can lead to other malnutrition impacts. It can also be fatal, especially among kids. And now this rice, which is a subsistence staple crop, can produce it. So you could address this malnutrition issue with this one single rice, and it can be planted in the same environment as your other rice. And it was approved for use in the Philippines in 2021, and farmers were starting to grow it. And a court, because of misinformation about GMO crops this year, basically is halting that. They're telling farmers that they're not allowed to grow it anymore.
Wow.
And it's really harmful. And that's the harm of misinformation here, is that we have these people that are getting these public platforms to spread falsehoods that is actually harming people. We also have crops that are being developed to be more weather tolerant. So as climate change accelerates, we have a new, but Argentina developed a drought resistant wheat. So basically they put in a gene from sunflowers that allows it to preserve its metabolism in the absence of water. With increased climate change, normally wheat would wither and die very quickly. It's not very robust. This HB4 wheat can now survive in drought conditions and continue to grow once water returns. And it's going to be hugely impactful to save economies, save people's nutrition, save farmers' families. And we have so much resistance to these types of techniques that, we've really hindered the adoption of things. We could have many more tools in our tool belt, but the US and many other countries have been very slow to implement or approve these, even though these foods are more studied than the non-GE foods of, their counterparts. And it's really sad because the same technique that you use to modify a plant, we're using to make cancer treatments and neurodegenerative disorder treatments. And so I am concerned about, if people are so resistant to this science in crop science, how are you going to get buy-in for these life-saving medical treatments as well?
I think, that aspect of GMOs and how it benefits public health. As you mentioned, the golden rice being fortified with beta carotene, that precursor to vitamin A. And then a similar thing to that public health measure was fluoride added to the water supply, something which has been going on for decades. And we know that, based on a lot of data, that fluoride helps to remineralize the enamel layer of the teeth. So it helps us to avoid dental caries, plaque formation, all sorts of beneficial things for oral health. And I guess there's again been this slow rising wave of misinformation against fluoride. And I guess people are equating or correlating fluoride with neurodevelopmental disorders, lowered IQ, all sorts of other things as well. And this is also, I don't know if I'm being cynical here, but at the same time as the fluoride misinformation or people being anti-fluoride, there's also been a rise of fluoride-free products, which makes me think that the same people that maybe have investments or own fluoride-free products may be propagating this misinformation. What is your take on this whole link between fluoride and detrimental health effects? Is there any weight to that at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I share your cynicism because I see a lot of the people that are criticizing fluoride. They obviously are selling an alternative. But the irony here is that a lot of times the misinformation is born out of the appeal to nature fallacy, right? They're like, well, it's a synthetic thing. We shouldn't trust it, when we know that that's not true. There's lots of natural things that are very harmful, and science allows us to improve on them. But fluoride is funny because it's a naturally occurring substance, right? It's found all over the planet. It's found in organic, and this is chemistry form, organic compounds, as like minerals, things like various chemical formulations, things like fluoroacetates, fluoroalkanes. These are chemicals produced by plants to actually deter things from eating them. But then you have your inorganic fluoride compounds, your minerals like fluoride and fluoroapatite and cryolite and so on. And these are in sediments, they're in soil, they're in water. And so fluoride is everywhere, right? It's in the water because you have erosion of rocks, minerals. You have it in the soil for the same reason. You have it in the air because fluoride can be produced through like dust storms and volcanic eruptions. Plants drop fluoride from their roots. And as I mentioned, some produce these fluoride chemicals. But we've harnessed this because a really long time ago, people noticed that in this one community, they had some slight discoloration of their teeth, but they weren't experiencing dental decay like other communities. And they realized because they had naturally higher levels of fluoride in their water. And so they were like, hey, how can we utilize this to improve the dental health, right? And so we've been fluoridating water at a very low level, but it's a low enough, it's a low level, a safe level, but it's high enough that it improves the dental health. And so it shifts the dental enamel to a more stronger polymer so that it can withstand a more acidic environment in your mouth so it won't demineralize. And we have 75 plus years of data. It's also extremely cost effective. It's very inexpensive, and it saves millions and millions of dollars every year on health. And because of misinformation, there are townships and cities that have removed fluoride, and you're seeing increased rates of cavities, especially among children, up to 50% higher rates compared to when they previously fluoridated their water. But then you see people who are like, well, other countries don't do this. And they don't realize that in many other countries, instead of fluoridating their water, they fluoridate their salt. And so people are still getting their fluoride, and it's still having that benefit. But when you talk about the toxicity, it goes back to that conversation about water, right? Anything can be toxic at a certain dose. The level at which we're fluoridating our water, it's 0.7 parts per million. To experience skeletal impacts of fluoride, where it's leading to maybe some like the fluorosis or bone growth issues, you would need to get up to 4 milligrams per kilogram a day. And say you're talking about a kid drinking fluoridated water, they would experience water toxicity orders of magnitude sooner than they would experience fluoride toxicity. And so, we're basically kind of ignoring all of this context. And when people are saying, well, it's linked to these neurological issues and IQ and cancer, what they're looking at are these observational studies where they looked at fluoride levels due to naturally occurring fluoride that were several orders of magnitude higher than what we're fluoridating water at. And they're just looking at IQ or neurological performance in kids. They don't correct for any confounding variables, right? They're not looking at things like education level, genetic factors, things that actually affect IQ. And several of these studies that are cited, there were other things in the environment, like high arsenic levels in the soil, high asbestos, communities that were doing a lot of coal burning, things that actually could have, causal relationships. And so you can't actually make those conclusions. But the problem is that these studies are taken out of context by people who don't know how to interpret the data appropriately. And then these headlines really go rampant. but there's no causal relationship or causal evidence that the fluoride, particularly the levels that we would have in water or in salt in other countries or in fluoride containing dental products, would ever be linked to these things. But what we're doing is we're eroding this decades upon decades upon decades long public health intervention that will actually harm health.
I think when you talk about those public health interventions we've had for decades, one of the things which will probably have Louis Pasteur curdling in his grave is raw milk, this raw milk trend, which has come out of nowhere. And it's probably the peak of this appeal to nature fallacy that we're seeing all across social media. And again, I sort of have an understanding, why people come about this idea of having raw milk. It's coming straight from the source. And there's, I guess, this perception that it might have a greater degree of probiotics, which it probably does, but it also has pathogens. Maybe it retains more nutrients, but, nothing, not significantly more than pasteurized milk. And, I really don't understand where it's come about, because we've gone decades where we've had pasteurized milk that's been heat treated, and we've seen a direct result. A direct result of that pasteurization is that we've seen a plummet in the, incidence of foodborne illnesses because of using heat to treat meats, food products, milk products. But then, we're seeing a rise in foodborne illnesses associated with raw milk because of this trend. And do you think that trend is also a direct result of social media, or is there something else behind the raw milk trend that we're seeing again?
No, I mean, I think it's a direct result of social media. There's a lot of prominent podcasters and wellness influencers that have been amplified by celebrities, and many of them actually have zero science and medical qualifications. And yet because the UFC guy elevated them, they're all of a sudden perceived to be an expert in science and health, and they make a lot of money selling a lot of misinformation. And it's really shocking that, these are the same people that are talking about how, our food is poison and it's unhealthy. And they're like, well, let's do away with all of the food safety regulations. In the US, we have certain states that have bypassed the pasteurized milk ordinance, which was put into law in the 1920s. And that was essentially to require pasteurization of milk products. But there's certain states that have relaxed their laws. And when you look at the states or the places that were having raw milk foodborne illness, 78% of the raw milk outbreaks are in the states where the sale of raw milk is allowed at the state level. In other states where it's prohibited, you're seeing farm shares, people knowing someone that has cows and they're getting it kind of illegally or, behind the scenes. And so it's really problematic, and there's zero reason why raw milk should be available for human consumption, because you're absolutely right. It's not healthier. It's not more nutritious. It does contain pathogens. And even if there were more probiotic bacteria, by the time they get to your stomach, they're going to be killed by your stomach acid because it's extremely acidic. And you have 40 trillion bacteria already in your GI tract. Anything that you're going to get from raw milk is either going to be killed by your stomach acid because there's no enteric coating on them, or it's a drop in the bucket. It's not going to actually do anything to substantially improve your health. But you're putting yourself at risk. You're putting your family at risk. And you have these influencers who claim that, the proteins are worse in pasteurized milk. It's better for your immune system and so on. And none of that is based on reality. There's no deterioration of the quality of the proteins in pasteurized versus raw milk. It doesn't impact how you would process and extract nutrients from milk proteins because you're breaking those down into amino acids anyway to use them. There's no losses in nutrients that are going to cause clinical outcomes. And there's also, claims about how it reduces allergies and asthma. And this is, this kind of farm effect where people are like, well, kids that grew up on a farm, they have, lower allergies. And this is really kind of an observational association. And there's no causal data about this. And it also doesn't decrease the incidence of lactose intolerance because, lactose intolerance is about how much of the enzyme lactase you produce to digest this milk sugar, right? But pasteurization doesn't impact lactose at all. It's not impacting a sugar when you're temporarily heating a milk product. And there's no data. There's been studies, a couple of small studies, that there's no difference in lactose intolerance symptoms on raw versus pasteurized milk. So there's zero reason we need to, be in enabling this. And certainly there's a lot of reasons we shouldn't be enabling it.
I think when it comes to looking at information online, the best I can describe it, sometimes it's like a swamp. It's a real mire of misinformation. There's a lot of good stuff there, but you can easily get sidetracked and go down these rabbit holes where, the same person can give some good information, but also some bad. And even the person who gives bad information can make it sound convincing, as we've suggested before. Person who gives good information can just maybe not communicate it in the right way. So at least I know that when I'm searching some information online, there's a corner of the internet where I can look at your stuff and I can come across some really rigorous science and, be reassured that I'm not going to die if, I expose myself to X, Y, or Z. So I really want to thank you for coming on and shedding a light on a lot of these very topical things, which, rightfully instill fear in some people, but also hopefully after listening to this, they should be fear-free.
Thanks for having me. I love what you're doing. I think, one of the things that I try to convey to people is, your body is really good at doing most of the things. You don't really need to mess with it all that much. And usually when people are suggesting that you can or should be doing that, it's often because they have an ulterior motive and they're trying to scare you. On the flip side, there's a lot of things out of your control, right? Your genetics, your socioeconomic status to some degree. And some people find it really anxiety inducing to realize that, no, you can't hack everything about your health, or, you could do everything right and still develop cancer. But some people find it very liberating. And I think, you have to approach everything you do with that kind of more measured take and realize that if people are pushing content to you that is really disparate from that, in conflict with that, they're saying these all or nothing things, it's very likely in an attempt to mislead you.
Yeah. So, hopefully someone can listen to this and get more science and less sensationalism.
Absolutely.
Thanks again to Dr. Andrea Love. What questions would you like to ask Dr. Love if you had the chance? Let me know in the comments and I might even put them to her in a future episode. Subscribe so you don't miss the weekly Dr. Curran Explores podcast, and I'll see you juicy little conspiracy theorists next week.